May 8, 1945, a mountain highway just south of Marquartstein, Austria. A jeep patrol from the 101st Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron rounded a bend in the road and found the war already over, except that no one had told the men standing in front of them. A Waffen-SS officer stepped into the road under a white flag. He wasn't there to fight, he was there to negotiate. And the first thing he told the American soldiers who stopped him was strange enough that they radioed it back word for word. His unit did not answer to the German army group that had already surrendered days earlier. So as far as he was concerned, that surrender didn't apply to him. His men were still armed, still organized, still technically at war. Behind him, hidden in the village of Schwendt, sat several hundred heavily armed Waffen-SS troops from the XIII SS Army Corps, the 13th SS Army Corps, under the command of SS-Gruppenführer Max Simon. Simon was not a man who surrendered easily. By this point in the war, he'd built a reputation as one of the most committed Nazi commanders left standing, a general who'd led his men through years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front and had no history of backing down. Germany's unconditional surrender to the Western Allies was being finalized in Reims at that very hour. Hitler had been dead for 8 days, and yet here was a fully armed SS Corps dug into a mountain village, still deciding for itself whether the war was actually finished. Here's where this story gets interesting, and where I want to pause for a second before we go further. Because this next part of the story only exists because people like you keep pulling threads like this one. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about the details most channels skip past. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. I read every single one, and it's exactly why I keep digging up moments like this, instead of just retelling the famous ones. Now, back to that roadblock. The American cavalry officers who reached Simon's line that day didn't have the rank to accept a Corps-level surrender, and Simon knew it. So he made a specific, deliberate demand. He would not lay down arms for a captain or a colonel. If the 13th SS Army Corps was going to surrender, he told them it would surrender to an American general. Not just any general. He wanted the terms handled by someone senior enough that his own men would understand this wasn't a rout, it was a negotiated end. The request went up the chain that evening. And the answer that came back down told you almost everything about how far this division's reputation had traveled in 11 months of war. The general they sent was Major General Maxwell D. Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. Think about what that meant on the ground in Schwendt that night. This was not some green American formation Simon's staff had never heard of. 5 months earlier, 5 German divisions, including SS Panzer units, far better equipped than what Simon had left, had surrounded roughly 15,000 American paratroopers at Bastogne in temperatures that dropped below -20 degrees Celsius, demanded their surrender, and received a one-word answer: nuts. The Germans had thrown everything they had at that perimeter for over a week. It hadn't broken. That story had traveled through the Wehrmacht's own communications network for months, whether Simon's men had fought at Bastogne themselves or not. And now, in the final days of the war, when an SS Corps commander was choosing exactly which American general he was willing to hand his sword to, he chose the one attached to the division that hadn't given an inch in the Ardennes. So on the morning of May 9, 1945, General Maxwell Taylor arrived at Schwendt to formally accept the surrender of the 13th SS Army Corps, Max Simon's own corps, without a single additional shot fired between his division and Simon's men. An entire armed Waffen-SS formation, still capable of putting up a fight in those final chaotic days, chose to stand down rather than test the Screaming Eagles one more time. But to understand why an SS general would make that specific choice, why the mere presence of the 101st Airborne changed the calculation for a man who had never surrendered anything easily in his life, you have to go back 5 months earlier, to a frozen forest in Belgium, where the reputation that walked into Schwendt that morning was actually built. December 16, 1944, 5:30 a.m., the Ardennes Forest, Belgium, before there was a roadblock in Austria. There was a forest in Belgium where the reputation that would matter 5 months later was actually forged. That morning, Hitler launched his last major offensive of the war, Operation Wacht am Rhein, what history now calls the Battle of the Bulge. 3 German armies, backed by 5 divisions worth of armor and infantry near one critical crossroads town, tore through thinly held American lines in the opening hours, and the Allied High Command made an emergency call: send the 101st Airborne to hold Bastogne. The paratroopers had 18 hours to get there. Most had no winter gear. Many hadn't eaten a full meal in 2 days. They drove through the night past retreating American units, who shouted warnings about German tanks and SS troops closing in, and kept driving toward the sound of the fighting anyway. Quick clarification before we go further, because precision matters here. The American patrol that actually stopped Max Simon's officer on that Austrian highway in May wasn't paratroopers. It belonged to a separate reconnaissance unit, the 101st Cavalry Regiment. But when Simon demanded a general be sent to formally accept his corps' surrender, the name that came back was unmistakable: Maxwell Taylor, commanding general of the 101st Airborne. That's the thread this story is actually about. Not who found him on the road, but who Simon specifically wanted standing across from him when he laid down his arms. And that request only makes sense once you understand what happened at Bastogne first. By December 21, 1944, the 101st Airborne, roughly 15,000 men, many of them support troops rather than combat infantry, with limited ammunition and almost no winter clothing, were completely encircled by 5 German divisions in temperatures that fell to minus 20 degrees Celsius. The next day, German General Heinrich von Luttwitz sent a formal surrender ultimatum through the lines. Acting Division Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word reply, "Nuts," has become one of the most quoted lines of the entire war. But the real story isn't the joke. It's what happened after the Germans got that answer. Full-scale armored assaults, repeated and coordinated, against a starving, freezing, outnumbered American perimeter that simply would not break. The siege held until December 26, 1944, when the 4th Armored Division broke through to relieve them. By the time the fighting around Bastogne finally quieted in January 1945, the 1st had absorbed roughly 300 casualties across its entire campaign in Europe, and had denied Hitler's last major offensive its single most critical objective. That's the name that had been circulating through the German army for months by the time Max Simon reached Austria in May 1945. And to understand why a man like Simon, who had never been the surrendering type, chose that name specifically, you need to know exactly who he was. Max Simon was born in Breslau in 1899. A veteran of the First World War who joined the SS in its earliest years in the 1930s. He rose through the ranks inside the SS Totenkopf, the Death's Head formation. And by October 1941, he'd earned the Knight's Cross commanding an infantry regiment on the Eastern Front. This was not a man who arrived at his rank through paperwork. In 1944, he took command of the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division, Reichsführer SS, in Italy, and it was there in the late summer and fall of 1944 that his division carried out 2 of the worst civilian massacres of the entire Italian campaign, Sant'Anna di Stazzema in August and Marzabotto in September and October, together killing well over 1,000 Italian civilians in anti-partisan operations. For these actions, Simon was later tried and sentenced to death by a British military court, a sentence eventually commuted to life imprisonment. In November 1944, while the killings in Italy were still being reported up the chain, Simon was promoted again to SS-Gruppenführer and given command of an entirely new formation, the 13th SS Army Corps, deployed against American forces in Lorraine and along the Siegfried Line. This was the man leading the withdrawal fight across Germany in the spring of 1945. The corps that reached the Danube and then Bavaria as the Reich collapsed around it. The same corps that would, within months, be standing on a mountain road in Austria, deciding whether one more fight was worth having. He was not a man inclined toward mercy, restraint, or surrender, which is exactly what makes the choice he made on that Austrian highway worth understanding, and exactly why the answer to who he demanded to surrender to tells you something real about what 4 years of war had taught the German High Command about the men wearing the Screaming Eagle patch. May 9, 1945. Schwendt, Austria. The day after the roadblock, General Maxwell Taylor drove up into the mountains that morning to finish what a jeep patrol had started the day before. Waiting for him in the village were several hundred Waffen-SS troops from the 13th SS Army Corps, still armed, still under discipline, still capable of making the next 24 hours violent if their commander decided that's what he wanted. Max Simon had spent the war building a reputation as a man who did not hesitate to use force against Soviet lines in the east, against Italian villages in 1944, against American armor in Lorraine that same winter. He had one more decision left to make, and he made it without a fight. The formal surrender of the 13th SS Army Corps was accepted. Corps command to division command, and the guns went quiet in that valley without another round fired between his men and the 101st Airborne. Whatever calculations Simon ran in his head that morning, the war already effectively over. Hitler 8 days dead, no strategic purpose left in a last stand in an Austrian village. The specific general he'd insisted on was not incidental. He'd had the chance to surrender to whoever showed up first. He waited for the one attached to the division that hadn't broken at Bastogne. It's worth sitting with how unusual that moment actually was. This was not a beaten, disorganized rabble looking for any excuse to stop fighting. Simon's corps had been conducting an organized fighting withdrawal for months, still functioning as a military formation right up until the final days. Waffen-SS units, more than almost any other branch of the German military, had a documented pattern throughout the war's final weeks of continuing to resist, sometimes suicidally, even after regular Wehrmacht formations around them had already given up. The SS had built its entire identity on the idea that surrender was something other, weaker armies did. And yet here was an SS Corps commander who had personally overseen some of the war's worst reprisal killings, choosing to end his war not in a firefight but in a negotiated handover, specifically to the Screaming Eagles. What happened to Max Simon afterward is its own uncomfortable postscript, and it belongs in this story because leaving it out would be dishonest. In 1947, a British military court in Padua tried him for his role in the Marzabotto and Sant'Anna di Stazzema massacres, the killing of well over 1,000 Italian civilians under his command. He was sentenced to death. That sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, and in 1954, Simon was released. He faced West German courts 3 more times in later years on related war crimes charges and was acquitted each time. He died a free man in Lunen, West Germany in February 1961 at the age of 62, nearly 16 years after standing on that Austrian hillside and deciding that fighting the 101st Airborne one more time wasn't worth what little was left of his war. There's no clean, satisfying moral to hang on that ending, and this channel isn't going to pretend there is one. The same reputation that made an unrepentant SS general choose surrender over one more battle didn't erase what he'd already done, and the post-war legal system's failure to hold him fully accountable is its own separate, real, and troubling story. What we can say with confidence, because the record supports it, is narrower and more specific. By May 1945, the name Screaming Eagles carried enough weight inside the collapsing German military that a corps commander who had never surrendered anything easily in 4 years of war chose to end his fighting career in front of that division rather than any other unit available to him. That's not a Hollywood ending. It's a data point, one soldier's calculation, made under the specific pressure of a specific reputation. At the exact hour the war in Europe ran out of road, Bastogne is the battle everyone remembers. The reply of nuts is the line that gets quoted at every reunion and every documentary, but the quieter proof of what that division actually built over 11 months of combat isn't in the quote. It's in a mountain road in Austria, in a corps commander who had every reason in the world to keep fighting and chose not to, because of exactly who was standing on the other side of that request. If you've stayed with this story through all 3 parts, you're exactly the audience this channel is built for. People who want the sourced, complicated version instead of the recycled one. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. I read everyone, and they're the reason the next story gets found.